all set. Okay, well, I want to thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. I'm starting a YouTube channel and interviewing activists and people involved in various things, so I really appreciate it. First, I want to say your resume, I looked at your blog, read your blog. Your resume is really impressive, super impressive. It's like you've done a lot of interesting things. We have a few things in common. Well, we're trans. I was also adopted. I'm not Korean, but I'm an adoptee. I only found out who my biological parents were like 2 years ago. Like, I was born in New York State, and the records are sealed. So I used one of the DNA, the genetic testing services, and it was really expensive. So that was a huge revelation for me. So I was reading your stuff about your ancestry. That was really moving. That was interesting. And so you went to Korea and did you go to like your ancestral village or?
Well, my ancestral village is Seoul,
Oh,
a
okay,
village
okay.
over 10 million people. Uh,
Yeah.
but I spent 4 weeks there. It was a hugely important trip. I would say, in some ways, it's the most important trip that I have ever made since the trip I took coming from Korea uh, when I was 7.5 months old.
Okay.
Uh, it was interesting on all sorts of levels. I ended up quite almost by happenstance being the keynote speaker at the Queer Korea Festival Seoul Pride Parade with an audience estimated at over 35,000 people.
Oh, oh, oh.
Yes. And then I also spoke to at a public forum on LGBT rights issues in Seoul. I connected with the Korean adoptee community there, and I also gave a talk at the organization that's advancing Palestine solidarity in Korea.
Okay.
And I took some time to see the country and explore the land of my birth. So it
Very
was a
good.
hugely important and amazing trip.
Okay, that's very interesting. What is the LGBT movement like in Korea now? Is it big? Is it accepted? Is it
It
growing?
is getting bigger. Uh, in some ways, Korean society, in a certain respect, is coming back to its roots. And what I mean by that is this: most people don't know this, but traditional Korean society was actually, in some ways, to use a very contemporary term, queer friendly. And by that I mean that there were people like us in some respects, people who I would call proto transgenderal, to use
Okay.
an expression that I coined. Before the Neo Confucian Revolution in 1392, that established a patriarchal social and political system in Korea that exists in some respects to this very day. Now, because of patriarchy, because of Confucianism, because of capitalism in some respects, and because of Christianity, Korean society is, on the whole, quite hostile to LGBT people.
Right.
And in some respects is arguably 25 years or more behind the LGBT movement in the US. That being said, it's a small but vibrant community and movement that is moving the country forward, and things are definitely better than they were, say, 15 or 20 years ago. There is much more visibility. There is increasing acceptance and understanding, at least in the big cities, in Seoul, in Busan, in Daegu. I think in smaller towns, in the countryside, it is still extremely difficult, if not possible, to be openly LGBT. But as I say, this is a society which is in the in the process of significant change, in some ways for the better, in some ways perhaps sadly for the worse. But it is definitely a society that has changed enormously since when I left there, to date myself, in 1961. At the same time, somewhat coincidentally, as the coup that brought Park Chung-hee to power. Park Chung-hee ruled Korea with an iron fist until his assassination in 1979. Interestingly enough, his daughter, Park Geun-hye, was elected president a few years back. She was the first woman elected president of the Republic of Korea. But as I like to say, electing the first woman president of the Republic is no guarantee of progressive or feminist government or governance.
Right, Hillary Clinton.
Yes, exactly. She is in some ways the Hillary of Korea, maybe even worse. She was the most right-wing president since democratization 30 years ago, and she is now in the big house. She moved from the blue house to the big house. She is in prison
Okay.
as part of a process of trial on corruption charges.
Right, there was a protest movement. I remember a huge protest movement against her.
The candlelight movement was extremely successful. It was a mass movement that brought, at one point, more than 2 million people to Gwanghwamun, which is the main square in Seoul, and there were mass protests in Busan, Daegu, and smaller cities as well. I think it's in some ways a model for what can be done. Now, sadly enough, her successor, Moon Jae-in, who ran as the progressive against two other candidates, one of whom was called the Korean Trump. Moon Jae-in won, but sadly enough, he's been something of a huge disappointment. In that respect, in some ways, he's the Barack Obama of Korea.
Right.
Who promises, as I like to say, Moon promised the sun and the moon, but he ended up just mooning the Korean people because what he's delivered has been a middling government that has not been very good on most issues. He explicitly excluded LGBT people from consideration under the rubric of human rights. He made a few overtures to the DPRK, the North Korean regime, but on the whole, he's been a rather enormous disappointment. He still has support, but it is definitely fallen below 40%. And so, as with Barack Obama, many promises made, very few kept. The only really good thing is he kept out two bad candidates, one of whom was very right-wing.
Okay, that's very interesting. How do people in South Korea, the Republic of Korea, feel about the North? What are the feelings towards the DPRK?
Well, I think there is, to couch this in binary oppositions, which I ordinarily try to avoid, but in this case, there really are kind of two binaries here to understand history. One is party political and ideological, and the other is generational.
Okay.
On the right, the anti-communist fervor on the right is such that South Koreans on the right are opposed to any negotiations with the DPRK and consider Moon Jae-in a traitor for even having initiated them. On the left, anyone from the center to the left welcomes some degree of discussion. Now, precisely what they favor depends on the individual, the group, the political party, but they're certainly open to what a previous president called the Sunshine Policy, which is an opening to the DPRK. There's also a huge generational divide. And here it's a bit surprising in a way because actually it kind of cuts across the partisan and ideological divide, in that the oldest South Koreans are the most intent, and one might almost say desperate. They feel the most urgency about reunification because many of them still have living relatives, family members in North Korea that they haven't seen for over half a century.
Right.
So for them, the division of Korea is a very real and very painful fact of life. They may have parents, siblings, other family members, friends on the north, in the north, who they have not seen and have not had contact with for over half a century. Among the younger generation, there's a kind of a different feeling, and this is a bit of a generalization, but at the risk of generalization, I would say that a lot of younger South Koreans view North Korea as this weird country that they have feel no connection to. It's on the other side of the DMZ. Maybe it's a threat, maybe not, but they do not feel the intense sense of identification with a unified Korea that members of the older generation do. So to that extent, there are these two kind of divides that kind of cut across each other in odd ways. I do think, once again, at the risk of generalization, I'll say that on the whole, most South Koreans, and I'm sure most North Koreans, fervently wish for the reunification of Korea. Now, what that looks like, of course, depends tremendously on the person's partisan, ideological, political perspective, and personal situation. I'll tell you my feeling. I strongly support the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. But I think the result of reunification has to be democratic. It has to be free of foreign interference. I think ultimately it has to involve the withdrawal of US troops from the Korean Peninsula. And I think the big, if I may opine on a subject that I do not consider myself an expert on, I think the grand bargain here, the only one that's to be had, is an agreement between the US and China, who are frankly the dominant powers here. An agreement between them with the DPRK and the ROK, possibly with some understanding, tacit or explicit, on the part of Russia and Japan, for a unified Korea that is democratic, that does not have foreign troops stationed on its soil. China, the PRC regime is not a fan of the DPRK regime.
Yeah, there's some tension there.
I think they see the DPRK regime as some fossilized Stalinist relic that has not gone the way that China did under Deng Xiaoping, which is basically capitalization. So you have this communist capitalist regime, the largest capitalist economy in the world, run by a one-party communist state.
Right.
The DPRK has only one value, I think, to China, because China actually trades more with South Korea than North Korea. I mean, North Korea doesn't have that much to offer. It has armaments, maybe some minerals and hydroelectric power. All the export goods that advanced industrialized economies want are coming from South Korea. And Americans will be very familiar with the famous brands like Samsung and LG, not to mention Hyundai, which makes cars, etc., etc. But what the PRC regime does not want is the collapse of the DPRK regime with US troops staring across the Yalu River, shades of Douglas MacArthur and rollback. And so I think they view North Korea as this buffer state between them and US troops, which are now, south of the DMZ. And so I think the only way to move forward, which is not going to happen under Orangina Trampolini, is for some understanding to be reached between the US and the PRC involving a tacit recognition that a reunified Korea is not only in the best interests of the Korean people, but in the best interests of quote unquote regional stability in East Asia. And at some point, that I think will happen. There's one other little wrinkle here, which is the South Korean people, once again at the risk of generalization, do not want to have to pay billions, if not trillions of dollars to subsidize a bailout of the North Korean economy, such as happened with the collapse of the GDR, the DDR regime in former East Germany. I was actually in Germany. This is a little fun fact you might have come across on my website. I was in that crowd of 3 million people in the Tiergarten in Berlin at midnight on October 3rd, 1990, when the President of the Federal Republic and the Chancellor rang in formal reunification.
Okay.
One of those living moments in history as we strode through the Brandenburg Gate and the chimes went off announcing the reunification. Another fun fact, they studiously avoided using the German word for reunification, which is Wiedervereinigung, which has very Bismarckian overtones. They didn't want to frighten the French and the Poles, so instead they used this odd little euphemism. They called it der Tag der Deutschen Einheit, der Neue Deutschen Einheit, which means the day of German unity or new German unity, which was very bland and very non-frightening. But the South Koreans saw the cost to West Germans running into the billions, if not the trillions of dollars of subsidizing the incorporation of East Germany into the reunified Germany. And given that the South Korean economy is now not really all that great, it's not in great shape, they don't want to be burdened with this enormous sort of reunification tax. So that's another key element in the picture. But I do think that Korea will eventually be reunified, and I certainly hope it'll be a peaceful reunification, ushering in a democratic regime that involves the withdrawal of U.S. troops and involves the recognition by China, Japan, Russia, the U.S., and other states.
Okay, very interesting analysis. Thank you for sharing that. You talked about transgender identities in Korea and other non-Western cultures. You have a couple articles. One was In Search of Queer Ancestors, very interesting. And a couple, and there's one, I think it's Mudang you
Right.
identify with? Okay, was that connected with shamanism?
Yes.
Like, sometimes?
Yes. So Korea, no one knows exactly when or where the Korean people came from, but there's a theory, the Altaic theory, that the Korean people descended into the Korean peninsula from eastern Siberia millennia ago. The Korean shamanic culture, which you could call the Mudang culture, is very closely related and very similar to the shamanic culture, which is still practiced to this day by the Chukchi in eastern Siberia, who are the cousins to the Inuit in North America. And that shamanic culture is very woman-centered and earth-centered. The high priest or priestess, to use a Western term, is the Mudang, and there are different terms for Mudang, also Manshin and Musakin, but the Mudang, who is the shaman in that culture, is usually a woman. However, there's considerable evidence that going back millennia, a significant number of mudang were male, paksu mudang. Now, whether they lived as, to use contemporary terminology, transgendered women, or whether they were simply wore the garb of the mudang, which is essentially a woman's shamanic garb, during the performing the rituals and rites of the mudang culture, is not entirely clear. My guess is that a significant number of them were males living as women in pre-modern Korean society. And so pre-modern Korean society was both matrilineal, not matriarchal, but matrilineal, and was earth-centered and had at its heart this shamanic culture, which, to use a contemporary term, was queer-friendly. Now, most contemporary Koreans or Korean Americans you talk to, if you mention this to them, they will have no idea what you're talking about. This is one of those hidden histories that needs to be unearthed to reinsert queer Koreans, including trans Koreans, in the dominant narratives of their culture. Because what happened was, three things happened, maybe four things. First, you had the Sinicization of Korean culture from the 7th century onwards. China played a huge role in influencing Korean culture and society. And China was a very patriarchal society with a very rigid system of patriarchal relations that was codified by Confucius, Kung Fu-Zi. And so Korea imported many of those Chinese ideas. Buddhism and Taoism, as well as Confucianism, were imported from China into Korea and Japan as well. And in 1392, when Yi Sung-gae, the first king of the last dynasty, the Yi dynasty or the Joseon dynasty, established the dynasty, he surrounded himself with Confucian, Neo-Confucian scholars and decided to emulate Chinese society by imposing a strict Chinese form of patriarchy on a society that was not heretofore patriarchal. And in some ways, Korea is still recovering from that patriarchy, that imposition of Confucian patriarchy. In the 19th century, a number of Christian missionaries came from Europe and North America, and most of them came from three denominations. Most of the missionaries were Catholic, Presbyterian, or Methodist, which is why most Koreans today who are Christian identified are Catholic, Presbyterian, or Methodist, both in South Korea and here in the US. And unfortunately, while those denominations have moved forward somewhat haltingly on LGBT issues in the US, in Korea, they're still stuck in the 19th century. They're profoundly homophobic and transphobic. So Christianity has played a significant role in creating hostility towards LGBT people. In fact, the main opposition to LGBT rights in Korea is coming from Christian fundamentalists. About 40% of South Koreans are Christian identified. The others are Buddhist or identify in some other fashion. And most of those Christians are, in a very real sense, evangelical and or fundamentalist. The third or fourth influence, communism in the North, capitalism in the South. Now here's an interesting fun fact. In 1963-64, both the ROK and the DPRK regimes began a witch hunt, and I would use that phrase very specifically because they both launched anti-Mudang campaigns.
Wow.
Oddly enough, at the same time, even though these two regimes weren't talking to each other, and there's no evidence that this was coordinated. In the North, the communist regime of Kim Il-sung viewed the Mudang culture as a relic of an anachronistic past, and wanted to wipe it out in order to ensure uniformity of ideological thinking. In the South, the Mudang culture was seen as a threat to modernization, and South Korea was just beginning to recover from the Korean War, and there was a renewed emphasis on Westernization in the wake of the end of the Korean War. And the Christian influence was very strong, including some Christian influence on Syngman Rhee, who was the CIA-imposed dictator, president for life of the Republic of Korea. So you had this kind of odd coincidence of campaigns launched by both the DPRK and the ROK against the Mudang in the early 1960s.
Okay.
And so there's a very interesting sort of phenomenon here of the continued survival of this ancient, earth-centered, woman-centered, non-patriarchal spiritual culture, which is very deeply connected with pre-modern queer identities, particularly what I would call the proto-transgenderal identity of the Paksu Mudang.
Okay, it's very interesting. Well, it's very interesting. How are Buddhists with LGBT rights?
On the whole, they're a lot less hostile than Christians,
Okay.
not surprisingly. And in fact, in Thailand, which is the most Buddhist country in Asia, there's a far greater degree of tolerance than in any other country. Now, tolerance isn't exactly the same as acceptance, if I may put that out there. And so it's not necessarily the case that Buddhists are at the barricades waving placards for transgender rights. However, there was a kind of a deeply ingrained live and let live philosophy in Buddhism. And so Buddhists in South Korea are very rarely hostile in the explicit and aggressive way that Christians are in South Korea. And I think Korean society is slowly moving forward on LGBT acceptance. I think it will take many, many years. But the fact is that when I spoke at the Queer Korea Festival, Seoul Pride Parade, it was the first queer event ever held in Old City Hall Plaza, which is the center of Seoul. It's absolutely smack dab in the center of Seoul. It's like holding a demonstration or an event in Times Square. It's absolutely in the center of the city. It's across the street from one of the 5 royal palaces, Deokseong Palace. And so that in and of itself was a signal that the movement had arrived at a certain level. Now, I might add that Christian fundamentalists bussed hundreds of people to the square to ring the square with people protesting.
Yeah.
If you read my account, they were banging on kettle drums. They actually wheeled kettle drums into the square and were singing hymns and waving Bibles and waving flags. One of the huge ironies is that the Korean flag, if you look at it, is called the Taeguki, has Taoist symbols. It has
The yin yang, Bhagwan stand.
and the hexagrams,
Right.
the I Ching hexagrams. So here they're waving this flag with Taoist symbols at a group of queer Koreans and their allies who are much more, on a certain fundamental level, connected to pre-modern Korean culture, which was queer-friendly and queer-inclusive, to use a somewhat anachronistic contemporary term. Meanwhile, they're waving Bibles. Well, where did Christianity come from? These Korean Christians seem to think that Christianity was the indigenous religion of Korea.
Right.
But, you know, as I like to say, he was Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Namsadong,
Right.
um, uh, or Namdaemun. And so the irony of the whole thing is that they don't understand that they are, in fact, um, proselytizing on behalf of a Western import. Uh, I'll add one funny little anecdote here. I thought the funniest thing was um, as I was weaving my way through the Christian fundamentalists to get to the square, which was surrounded by a 6 foot high plastic uh, canvas wall that the police had erected to keep out the fundies. They had a line of girls, the Christian fundamentalists had a line of teenage girls doing little ballet steps to the music of Tchaikovsky, who, of course, is the gayest composer in
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
And so there was this bizarre incomprehension, lack of understanding of the extent to which their uh, practices here were and are Western imports, not indigenous to Korea, and a complete ignorance of the connection of queer people to the indigenous spiritual tradition of Korea, which is this shamanic culture.
Right. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Yes, you've talked about in your writing about transgender identities in other non-Western cultures. It seems to have been a universal thing. Native American tribes had trans identities,
Yes.
possibly Norse, ancient Norse Vikings may have. It was pretty widespread. Even China probably did very early, like Shah Dynasty. Was
Yeah,
wondering.
I was going to add one footnote, which is the interesting fact here. In the last few years, I've become very interested in Viking spirituality,
Okay.
which sounds a bit of a contradiction in terms, but in fact, my father was descended from Vikings.
Okay, yeah,
So he was
the
the
Norwegian background you
yes,
mentioned.
he was the least Viking-like person you would ever meet. Very quiet and unassuming, but while we think of the Vikings as these he-men who went out uh, to plunder, which and there's a considerable amount of truth to that. There's also a queer-friendly shamanic culture, which is surprisingly similar to the Mudang culture in Korea, as well as indigenous shamanic cultures around the world. In Viking society, there was a strong binary opposition. Men were expected to be masculine. There was a very definite binary, sex gender binary in operation there, and women were expected to take care of the home. However, Viking women were more independent and had more rights than any other group of women in that period in Europe. Um, anything related to um, anything related to what we might call witchcraft or prophecy was considered women's work. But there was a small number of males who actually participated in the Scyther culture. And so they were like the Paksumudang. They were a part of that culture because they renounced participation in warfare in favor of participation in Scyther. Scyther literally means seeing. And so they participated in that culture with women. And this is a little fact that is very little known among people who have this widespread and not entirely inaccurate image of these Viking he-men going around raping and pillaging, which they certainly did. But there was this other aspect to Viking culture which very few people know about. And so when I started to read about this, I thought it was such an interesting parallel between the culture of my father's Norwegian ancestors and the culture of my Korean ancestors.
That's interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. Um, so I guess transgender identities existed in many cultures, many parts of the world. What would be your pushback against TERFs? trans exclusionary radical feminists. They seem to be fairly big in the British left, unfortunately, and I'm not entirely sure why.
Well, I have to say, as a fan of the Harry Potter books and movies,
Okay.
I am incredibly disappointed in
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling. She should know better. Here's someone who created this wonderful world of the imagination, but can't bend her head around the fact that trans women are women and trans men are men. Um, the turf thing is really disturbing. There's good news and bad news. The bad news is that they continue to persist and they continue to target trans people, especially transgendered women, for harassment online and off. And for some odd reason, they still have a fair amount of strength in the UK. I think the good news is that they have basically lost. They've lost both within the LGBT community because they have not persuaded the LGBT community of their ridiculous screed that transgender is just a plot to eliminate homosexuality, which of course is bizarre nonsense. Um, that trans women are just men who are appropriating female bodies, and that trans men are just women, maybe butch lesbians, who can't deal with their homosexuality and therefore are appropriating heteronormative male privilege. Now, of course, it's all nonsense. Um, but it persists for a variety of reasons. I think part of it is generational. To be honest, most of these women are older, and most of them are second wave feminists circa 1970 who haven't even caught on to the third wave, let alone the fourth wave. They don't get gender queer. The root of it, I think, I think there are a number of sources here. One is basically, frankly, a kind of misandry. Now, I think real feminism is a critique of masculinist discourse and masculinist discourse of power. Misandry or misandry is a hatred of men as men, which I think is stupid because that's not where it's at. So that's one aspect. And I also hate it when anti-feminists like Rush Limbaugh label all feminists men haters, which of course is absurd.
Yeah.
But there's a small minority of people in the feminist community who I would not call feminists. I don't think they're true feminists, who actually just hate men and who say ridiculous things like all heterosexual sex is rape. Well, that's absurd because if that were true, then no man and woman could ever have sex without it being sexual assault. And it trivializes actual rape. There's another source, which is sort of the ideological source, I think, of TERF thinking, which is biological essentialism or determinism. And it's the notion that you are what the genitals were assigned to you at birth happen to be, which is an absurd way of thinking about the world. First of all, from a purely technological point of view, we can now change bodies, both biologically and anatomically, through hormone replacement therapy and sex reassignment surgery. That's simply the reality. Secondly, and I think more importantly, is this bizarre notion that the possession of a vagina makes you warm and nurturing, and the possession of a penis makes you an aggressive rapist. I lived for 2 years under Margaret Thatcher, and I can assure you her vagina did not make her warm and nurturing.
Right.
And so you have this bizarre biological essentialist ideology which insists on a binary opposition, which in fact is a rearticulation of the sex gender binary, but simply in a way that privileges an understanding of cisgendered female bodies.
Right.
And we should not be privileging one set of bodies over another. We should not be privileging one set of assigned birth sex and birth gender identities over another. To me, true feminism means articulating a critique of the sex gender binary and challenging and dismantling that binary so that we can all be whoever we see ourselves as. Assigned birth sex, to insist on assigned birth sex, aligns TERFs with Christian fundamentalists and right-wing Republicans. And it's no coincidence that they are now, in fact, in the US certainly, and in other countries as well, aligning themselves with the most right-wing and reactionary forces in society and politics and government. And you had the spectacle of one of these TERFs testifying before the Massachusetts state legislature, I think this was last year, on behalf of a rollback bill sponsored by a right-wing Republican. Now, if that doesn't tell you what these so-called feminists are all about, to me, it's a complete indictment of the TERFs. And as I say, I don't think TERFs are actually real feminists at all. I think they are biological essentialists who reify a particular and peculiar understanding of the sex gender binary that privileges those assigned female at birth and privileges that set of genitalia as representing something that it actually does not.
Right. Interesting. Right. Interesting. Yeah, hopefully it's a declining movement. Yeah, pivoting to another topic, you've done a lot of work with Palestinian solidarity, a lot of Palestinian solidarity work, and I think it's 2002, you were part of an LGBT delegation to, was that the West Bank or West Bank and
Yes.
Gaza?
So it was actually 2012. It's hard to believe that this was 8 years ago. In January 2012, I participated in the first, and so far only, US LGBTQ delegation to Palestine, which was organized by a number of people, including Sarah Schulman, who is a Jewish lesbian activist based here in New York, in cooperation with three queer Palestinian groups in Israel, Palestine, Al-Qaus, which is based in Ramallah, PQBDS, which is Palestinian Queers for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions,
Okay.
and a third organization for women and trans people based in Haifa, and called Aswat. So it was a historic journey. It was an attempt on the part of the 16 delegates, including me, and the two tour leaders, and others participating in the tour, to see firsthand for ourselves what conditions were like under the illegal Israeli occupation of the West Bank. Now, I would have loved to have gone to Gaza. We all wanted to go to Gaza, but Israel will not allow human rights activists into the Gaza Strip. They only allow a small number of relief workers from the UN and a handful of relief agencies and NGOs to enter the Gaza Strip. That's part of its illegal blockade, which is pursuant to its pursuit of genocide in the Gaza Strip. We did have a conference call with queer activists in Gaza while we were in Ramallah. But we spent a week traveling around the West Bank. We spent a little time in East Jerusalem. We also went to Tel Aviv and Haifa, and we met with LGBT and non-LGBT organizations and individuals on both sides of the Green Line. We met with members of Al-Qaus, which is the LGBTQ organization in the West Bank, and PQBDS. We also met with Palestinian farmers and villagers under siege by the misnamed IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, or as some people call it, the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Forces. And we met with ordinary Palestinians throughout the West Bank. We went all the way up to Nablus. We were in Hebron, Ramallah, and also Bethlehem, where we spent 2 nights in the largest Palestinian refugee camp in the West Bank, Dahesha refugee camp. And so it was an amazing experience. It was difficult. The conditions were difficult for a variety of reasons, because life under the occupation is difficult. And we weren't going there sponsored by a Zionist organization or sponsored by the Israeli government. So we didn't have any of the cushy luxuries that people who go there under such sponsorship enjoy. Most of those tours, if they go to the West Bank at all, they'll spend an hour in Ramallah and then drive right back across the Green Line. So they have no real experience of life under occupation. It would be like someone from Connecticut driving from Greenwich into Times Square, taking a few selfies in Times Square and driving back to Greenwich and saying that they'd experienced New York City. Well, that would be absurd. But that's what most of these tours that have the requisite token trip to the West Bank do. They don't spend time with real Palestinians. They might meet with some junior staffer of the Palestinian Authority. But the fact is the PA has lost all credibility. These were the 2 big takeaways from the trip for me. Most of what I saw in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, confirmed what I already knew from reading about it and talking with activists before I went over about the nature of the illegal occupation. The 2 big takeaways for me, the 2 surprises, were first, the extent to which the credibility of the Palestinian Authority has collapsed. Mahmoud Abbas and the Fatah faction at the PLO that run the PA are now seen, I think quite rightly, by most Palestinians as being collaborators with the occupation regime. The PA is really now little more than an arm of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The other big takeaway was the extent to which no one over there talks about the 2-state solution. Mm-hmm. The official discourse around Israel-Palestine is a 2-state solution, which dominates discussion of Israel-Palestine in the US. It's the official discourse in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, to some extent even in Ramallah, but it is completely out of touch with reality. Even if it had been at one point a potentially viable option, Benjamin Netanyahu has really killed the 2-state solution. Even if you think it's a good idea, and there are a lot of reasons to believe that it actually would not be a good idea, it is no longer feasible. The 2-state solution is dead. So the real choice is between a permanent apartheid regime in illegally occupied Palestine or a 1-state solution. And so I will say, not speaking on behalf of any group or organization, that I favor a 1-state solution because, as I say, the 2-state solution is dead, and the only other alternative is the permanent apartheid regime. Netanyahu has really closed off the possibility for a viable Palestinian state in the West Bank. There's a creeping de facto annexation that's going on. Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moving the embassy there, and the statement that he made last month that shifts U.S. policy, which has always regarded the illegal Israeli settlements as illegal. Those are, in fact, part of this creeping de facto annexation of the West Bank.
Right.
So the reality is there's already one state in place. Palestinians in the West Bank live under Israeli military law, under martial law in effect, whereas Jewish Israelis who live in the West Bank are entitled to the full protections and privileges of Israeli civil law. So you have two different laws for two different people and a system of state-sanctioned racial segregation, which is why Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was one of the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, has said that that Israeli apartheid is actually worse than South African apartheid was, and which is why the BDS movement, I think, is the way forward. One could debate the rightness of armed struggle. Certainly, the Palestinians living under legal occupation have the legal right to engage in armed defense under international law. However, both the first and second intifadas were put down with incredible violence by the forces of Israeli occupation. And so I don't think, regardless of the merits of armed struggle in terms of moral or political arguments, the reality is it's not going to work because Israel has a virtual monopoly on means of violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so BDS is the only way forward as far as I can see. BDS is nonviolent struggle in the tradition of the Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. It is ironic that Zionists call BDS violence when in fact it's nonviolent, but the reality is that they will call any opposition to Israeli occupation violence. I might mention that there's a very important aspect, queer aspect to this struggle. First of all, LGBT queer Palestinians have no special rights. There's no special pink card that the Israeli government issues to queer Palestinians living under the occupation. They face all the same impediments under Israeli military law in the illegally occupied West Bank as non-LGBT Palestinians. Second, Zionists and the Israeli government itself are engaged in a campaign of pinkwashing the illegal occupation, which is the argument that Israel is now supposedly better on LGBT rights than many of its neighboring countries, and therefore, non sequitur here, it has the right to subjugate millions of Palestinians under illegal military occupation. Now, of course, it's a complete non sequitur, and it's also not directly relevant to the question at hand, which is, does the state of Israel have the right to subject millions of Palestinians to an illegal occupation for over half a century, an occupation that began in 1967, which is part of a process that began of ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people of Palestine that began before the foundation of the State of Israel. In fact, the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people of Palestine in the Nakba in 1948 was, in fact, the foundation of the State of Israel. I had tea in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem after finishing my participation in the tour. I spent a few days in Jerusalem, which is a very ancient and historic city, beloved by adherents of three religions, in some ways too beloved. And I ran into some Australian human rights activists, a married couple and their daughter, and they do human rights work on behalf of East Timor, which of course was subjected to a violent ethnic cleansing and genocide by the Indonesian military. supported by the US. And we ended up going up the Mount of Olives, which is a fascinating place. And then I suggested we have tea at the King David Hotel. The King David Hotel is where the Nakhim Begin and the Stern gang of the Irgun blew up the hotel, which was where the British Mandate Authority was based in Jerusalem, killing nearly 100 people, most of whom were civilians of many different nationalities, not just British, in an attempt to drive the British out of British Mandate Palestine. And it actually worked, frankly, because the British eventually withdrew and essentially allowed the Zionist militias and paramilitaries to engage in this ethnic cleansing, unilaterally declaring the formation of the State of Israel and establishing the boundaries of the State of Israel as we know them today. After the 1967 war, they seized the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan and the Gaza Strip from Egypt. But as I say, this is all part of a very long process that really started in the late 19th century when Zionists, pursuing a European 19th century ideology of ethno-nationalism, declared that they would found a state of Israel in Palestine, which at that point was part of the Ottoman Empire before the British seized control of Palestine, drove the Ottoman Turks out, and ruled Mandate Palestine under this mandate from the League of Nations from the end of World War I until 1948. This was part of a larger picture in the Middle East. At the end of World War I, after Ottoman Turkey made the rather enormous blunder of siding with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Axis powers, Bulgaria, in World War I, the British and French carved up the Ottoman Empire like a turkey, as I like to say, in the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, the consequences of which we are still dealing with today. The French wanted part of the Middle East, and so the British gave them Syria and Lebanon in exchange for a free hand in Palestine, what's now Iraq, and other parts of the Middle East. And so the artificial lines that British imperialists drew way back in 1916, 1917, in the run-up to the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, are the national boundaries that we're still living with today, including the creation of this artificial entity, Iraq, and this artificial entity, Syria. And so we're still dealing with these consequences. So when I think of Palestine, I think not only of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, but all of what has been Israel, the state of Israel, since 1948. It's all historic Palestine, and it's all part of a land grab that started with the British Mandate, that involved immigration by European Jews in Palestine beginning in the 19th century. An interesting fact is that Zionism, most European Jews were actually anti-Zionist before World War II. And then the tragedy of the Holocaust, with 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, tipped the balance, and majority of European Jews then came over to favor settlement in Palestine and the formation of the State of Israel. But it's really important to remember that Zionism, first of all, is not Judaism. That's a conflation that Zionists are always trying to assert. Because if you assert that Zionism and Judaism are the same thing, then being anti-Zionist makes you anti-Semitic. But if that were the case, actually most Jews would be anti-Semites because most Jews are not Zionists. And so what we see in the US, in Europe, Australia, elsewhere, is this campaign of Zionist misinformation and disinformation. It was a significant factor in Jeremy Corbyn's defeat
Right.
in the British general election last month. Now, I think the biggest issue was Brexit, but there was this sustained campaign of slander and defamation by British Zionists against Jeremy Corbyn, including members of the Labour Party, who were determined to prevent a critic of apartheid Israel from becoming British Prime Minister. And the mainstream media bought into this. Even The Guardian, which is supposedly a paper on the left, even The Guardian played into this. Many of The Guardian columnists who are liberal on other issues, who are peeps, progressive on everything except for Palestine, fed into this, columnists like Jonathan Friedland. Well, as I like to say, the peeps are not my peeps. Being consistently progressive means supporting human rights for everyone in Israel-Palestine. It means opposing illegal military occupation, opposing ethnic cleansing, whether that takes place in occupied Palestine or Rakhine State in Myanmar. It means opposing every form of oppression, regardless of who's engaging in it. It means opposing real anti-Semitism, but also opposing the conflation of Zionism and Judaism, and the slander and defamation of BDS activists, falsely labeling BDS as anti-Semitic, because false allegations of anti-Semitism only trivialize and encourage real anti-Semitism.
Right.
And so being consistently progressive, feminist, and principled means supporting human rights for all, supporting social justice and justice for all, including Palestinians living under illegal occupation.
Right. It's interesting. Well said. Have you ever read this book, The Politics of Everyday by Holly Lewis? She
I
talks.
haven't.
I'm sorry?
I haven't.
Okay, it's really good. I think it's worthwhile. I'm gradually writing a review of it. She comes from a Marxist background, LGBT, tries to link up queer struggles with struggles for like Palestinian rights and other struggles, like it's type of intersectionality, but not the way that's usually used. So you show unconditional support for other oppressed people, even if they don't 100% accept you. You still have to unconditionally fight against everyone's oppression. So yeah, it's kind of close to what you were saying. What is the situation for LGBT people in Palestine, within Palestinian culture?
So I would put it this way. There is homophobia and transphobia in Palestinian society as in every other society on earth. But the notion that Palestinian society is monolithically homophobic and transphobic is simply false, as is the notion that Palestinian society is some atavistic society which never changes and is stuck in some sort of primitive time warp.
Mm-hmm.
There are two or three things that need to be pointed out here. First of all, to the extent that Zionists are pushing pinkwashing, the discourse of pinkwashing not only does not help queer Palestinians, it makes their situation more difficult. Because what they do in pinkwashing is set up a false dichotomy of binary opposition between liberal Israeli society, which is supposedly so LGBT inclusive, and Palestinian society, which is characterized as homophobic and transphobic, which is falsely characterized as fundamentalist. In fact, Islamic fundamentalism is really quite foreign to Palestine. The kind of Wahhabi fundamentalism that is the dominant discourse in Saudi Arabia, which in fact is the official sort of religious affiliation in Saudi Arabia, is not native to Palestine. And most Muslims in Palestine are in fact not fundamentalists of the Wahhabi sort. I might add, by the way, that 10% of Palestinians are Christian, and they get no special privileges either. In fact, Israel barred Palestinian Christians from going from Gaza to Jerusalem to celebrate, and Bethlehem to celebrate Christmas. And yet Christian Zionists in the US support Israel over the rights of their Christian and brothers and sisters in illegally occupied Palestine. There's a more specific problem, which is that Israelis engage in the entrapment of LGBT queer Palestinians under the illegal occupation. If the Israeli authorities find out that you're LGBT, they will essentially blackmail you into becoming an informant and an agent for the Israeli military in the state of Israel, which makes your position doubly precarious. It really puts one's life in danger. BDS, in contrast, has been enormously helpful for the queer Palestinian community. First, in the more general sense, that obviously the liberation of Palestine from illegal occupation would mean the liberation of queer Palestinians from illegal occupation. But secondly, and more specifically, and this is a point that not too many people understand, the BDS movement is the best weapon against homophobia and transphobia in Palestinian society. Because when they see LGBT queer groups in the US, Canada, Europe, etc., Australia, etc., standing in solidarity with Palestine, they say, oh, queer people are actually our allies. And this is a really important counter to the notion that being queer somehow makes you aligned with Israel. The Zionist notion that this is all false, but Zionists perpetrate this notion that if you're some gay teenager living in the West Bank, you just crawl over or under some fence somewhere, and it's not a fence, it's like a 20-foot high concrete wall, climb over or under some fence somewhere, make your way to Tel Aviv, get to a gay bar, and then you're safe.
Right.
That is absolutely ludicrous. No Palestinian has ever been offered political asylum in Israel because of their sexuality or gender identity. That never happens. That never happens. If you're Palestinian, queer or not, and you're caught on the other side of the green line, if you're not a citizen of the state of Israel, you will be sent back. At best, you'll be sent back. And if you're caught in a gay bar, you'll probably be blackmailed and forced to become an informant or a collaborator. So in contrast, what BDS does is send a signal to Palestinian civil society that there are LGBT people standing in solidarity with Palestinians. LGBT people in the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, etc. There's an organization based in Chicago called A Wider Bridge, which is very well funded by Zionist donors, which was founded specifically to pinkwash the illegal Israeli occupation. If you go to their website, you can see what they're up to. They are deliberately engaged as agents provocateurs to try to disrupt different formations and cast themselves as the victims of anti-Semitic harassment and violence. Perfect example of that was the Chicago Dyke March in 2017, when a number of members of a wider bridge entered the march, the Chicago Dyke March, under false pretenses and started unfurling Israeli flags, started chanting Zionist slogans. The Chicago Dyke March, the collective that runs the Chicago Dyke March, had decided that they would specifically exclude Zionist participation in the march.
Okay.
And a wider bridge was determined to try to get the international media, national and international media, to cover some incident that they would provoke and claim that there were Jewish lesbians who were expelled from the Chicago Dyke March for being Jewish. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were expelled because they were explicitly violating the rules, one of which was no Zionist slogans or symbols. One of the women who proposed that rule is, in fact, a Jewish trans woman who's anti-Zionist. And so a wider bridge sent these agents provocateurs to the Chicago Dyke March to disrupt it, create some sort of scandal, and get the media, not only the Zionist media like the Jerusalem Post, but the mainstream media in the US and abroad, to cover this incident as an example of anti-Semites attacking, expelling Jews from the Chicago Dyke March, when in fact, many of the members of the Dyke March and the collective are in fact Jewish themselves, but anti-Zionist.
Right.
Same thing happened. I wrote about the Creating Change incident in Chicago a few years back, where a number of people protested the presence of Zionists at the conference, and there was a demonstration which Zionists then, including a wider bridge, deliberately mischaracterized as an anti-Semitic attack. And they used the slogan, which is often chanted at Palestine solidarity demonstrations, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They deliberately mischaracterized that as a call for the genocide of the Jews, which of course is not at all what that slogan means. It means the liberation of Palestinians from illegal Israeli occupation. So that's what we're up against. The good news, and here I'm going to cite the leading Republican pollster in the country, Frank Luntz, who did a secret survey. He's a pollster as well as a campaign consultant for ADL and two other Zionist organizations, in which he found that Zionists were losing the argument, that there was a sea change going on within the Jewish community, especially young Jewish Americans are turning against Israel because of its brutal suppression of peaceful resistance to the illegal occupation. That's also happening within the Democratic Party, which up until a few years ago was very solidly Zionist. What we're seeing now, quite shockingly, I might add, is Zionists going after Bernie Sanders, the only Jewish candidate